If you grew up in church, you probably went to Sunday school and learned all about the miracles that Jesus did during his earthly ministry. But sometimes looking at those individually in a scattered, sort of haphazard way is kind of like looking at a brick and saying, what a beautiful brick, but failing to sort of stand back and see that that brick is part of a larger, more beautiful, more glorious construction. And so over the next 6 weeks, what I want to do is I want to look at 6 individual miracles that Jesus performs, but I hope that we can sort of tie them together into a broader picture of Jesus' identity and his mission. The things that Jesus does are, well, far greater than what we know. After all, in the last verse of his gospel, John tells us that it's a practical impossibility to write a full account of what Jesus did. In John 21:25, he says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room enough for the books that would be written. So with this embarrassment of riches, the gospel writers, trying to help the early church understand who Jesus was, can pick and choose the particular miracles that are most illustrative of Jesus' mission. And so when we look at these miracles, we need to look beneath the surface. They're not just times Jesus did something funny or fancy. It's the time when Jesus used his connection to the Father to do something that pointed to who he was. So this first installment begins with a wedding. Now, weddings are a time of heightened hope and joy and expectation, and correspondingly, they can also be times of rather awkward situations. I've been to a few awkward situations in weddings. One was a wedding where I went and the minister very clearly forgot the bride's name and tried to cover over that fact in a way that convinced exactly nobody. Another time was a wedding that I went to as a photographer where, let's just say, there was a couple who started dating, and in the course of their relationship, his father, who was divorced, and her mother, who was also divorced, met each other and also hit it off. And at this wedding, it was the parents whose children were still dating and were now becoming stepbrother and stepsister, as well as boyfriend and girlfriend. You can imagine all the kinds of jokes that you might say because they said all of them. So weddings are these times when great embarrassments can happen, and this is another such example where something truly embarrassing happens. Read with me in John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from between 20 and 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So the wine had run out. Now, this may or may not be a big deal, depending on the company that you keep, on what kind of family you come from. I come from a family of teetotalers, and Carolyn's family is not really big into the booze. So we had a dry wedding, and nobody seemed particularly scandalized by that. At least nobody told me they were to my face. But that wouldn't be the case here. As I was doing some research, what I discovered that surprised me was that actually a person could get sued if they did not provide enough wine at their wedding. I guess the thinking is that you're coming with an extravagant gift, as would be the expectation, but the counter expectation is that the host would provide, hospitality to a certain standard. And running out of wine partway through the feast would be a failure to live up to this minimum standard. What was supposed to happen was that on the day that a Jewish family had a daughter, they were supposed to set aside a barrel of wine. And each year on her birthday, they were supposed to add one more barrel to that collection of wine, so that by the time she reached marriageable age, there would be an adequate supply for the celebration that would happen. We're not told what happened. Perhaps the wine was damaged. Perhaps the family was too poor or too stingy to set some aside. Or maybe they invited Jesus and he said, "Can I bring a couple of friends?" And they said yes, thinking there was one or two, but 12 thirsty guys showed up. We're not really sure. But we do know that it's a rather embarrassing moment when they run out of wine. The scandal of this will follow that family around for years to come. Oh, they're the people who didn't make adequate preparation for their daughter's wedding. Obviously, they didn't love her. So Jesus' mother comes to him and asks him to help. At first, Jesus seems reluctant. It's not really sure what she expects from Jesus. It says that this is the first sign that he does, so it's not like he has a history of miraculous interventions. But Mary seems to trust that Jesus can do something. And maybe Jesus is reluctant at first because he doesn't want to simply be the person who does party tricks. Then he perhaps sees those stone jars full of water used for ceremonial washing and says, "Oh, I think there's something I can work with here to communicate something about my ministry." And so he decides to take action. These stone jars are used for ritual washing, it tells us. Now, there are many times in the Jewish law where a person is commanded to bathe when they've come into contact with something impure. That's not what this is. This is an additional set of washing rituals that grew up after the Jews returned from their exiles. Mark makes reference to it in his gospel, saying that some Jews have elaborate rituals about washing their hands and washing pots and cups and stuff like that. And so what had happened is that the Jews had gone into their exile because they had been unfaithful to the law. They had been insufficiently distinct from the nations surrounding them. And the Jews who returned wanted to make extra special sure that they didn't transgress those boundaries and end up back in exile again. So what they would do is they would create boundaries around the boundaries. And now they would wash away the taint of anything that they deemed to be impure of their new devotion to God. So if they had dealings with a Jew who was not sufficiently faithful, a tax collector, I had to deal with him, I'll wash the filth of it off of my hands. Or, Gentiles, I had to talk to Gentiles, I better wash so that I am not guilty before God. And so these pots full of ceremonial washing water literally became a symbol of Jewish religious exclusivism. Because they are literally the difference between the washed and the unwashed, the righteous and the sinners, the religious insider from the religious outsider. And it is these particular things that Jesus is going to attack. He's going to substitute that sort of religious exclusivism with wine, which is a very complicated symbol. But we're going to look at some of the different layers of its meaning. On a surface level, wine is a symbol of hospitality. If you had a stranger in your home in that context, you'd be expected to provide wine for them. After all, it's safer than drinking water in that culture. It's also a symbol of celebration. Every good party needs some wine, they would think. Hence actionable legal recourse for failing to provide enough wine at a wedding. But wine also served as a symbol of abundance and blessing and the restoration of God's people. You see, as the Jews were headed towards an exile, as their faithlessness became so severe that became the inescapable conclusion to where things were headed, the prophets warned the people of Israel that God's discipline was coming, but also reassured them that there would be a time when God would restore their fortunes. And they may have expected, and so what ends up happening is that they speak about this time of restoration using wine language. So, for example, in Amos 9:13-15, he says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land that I have given them." Or also in Isaiah 25:6-8, he says, "On this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all people, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and he will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth." So wine was part of the language of symbols that the prophets used to talk about this new age where Israel would be restored to good fortune and good standing before God. Now, people might have thought that was going to happen a few generations later. After about 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, Cyrus defeats Babylon and decrees that the Jews who had been taken into exile in Babylon could return back to their land to rebuild the temple. But when they get there, things don't go as they had hoped. And this wonderful age of blessing foretold by the prophets doesn't seem to materialize. In Nehemiah, a couple of generations after the return of the first exiles, the Levites lament the failure of God to live up to their hopes for return from exile. In Nehemiah 9:36-37, they say, "But see, we are slaves today, slaves in the land you gave our ancestors, so that they could eat its fruit and other good things it produces. Because of our sins, its abundant harvests go to the kings that you have placed over us. They rule over our bodies and our cattle as they please. We are in great distress." So the Jews were humiliated by their exile, but the return had failed to live up to their expectations, as if God had overpromised and underdelivered. And then wine takes on one additional layer of meaning later in Jesus' story, at the Last Supper, when Jesus proclaims that the cup full of wine is a new covenant in his blood. And so, how do we put all of this together? Well, this signifies the paradox that Jesus' suffering love on the cross is God's act of hospitality. It is an occasion for celebration because it is bringing people in. And it is inaugurating this new age of restoration that the prophets had promised. And all of this takes place at a wedding. A wedding is the time and place where people who are not family become family. I remember on the day after my wedding, I asked my mother-in-law, Elsie, "Do you want me to keep calling you Elsie?" Or, "No, I want you to call me Mom." Well, we were strangers 8 months before, and we became family, and we still are family. And so when we look at all of these symbols together, what is the story trying to tell us? Well, what it's trying to tell us is that God is taking the things that separate insiders and outsiders, those boundaries, and he is throwing them away, and instead he is replacing them with a gracious act of hospitality initiated by Jesus' suffering death on the cross, in which all people are brought in. All people are received, and it is this event that is signifying the new age of God's restoration of his people. So this miracle is Jesus' sneaky way of previewing the gospel in advance. the new age has come upon us, and that its life is being lived by God's people, the church. Or it should be being lived by God's people, the church. But sometimes we don't live consistently with that life of the new age that Jesus announces. Right from the get-go, there's a difficulty that the church has in living consistently with this. And the presenting issue is the inclusion of Gentiles into God's people. If God is inviting the outsider in, do they need to become an insider to come in? Or can they be themselves when they come in? This was the crux of an argument that developed early on in the church. God in the law had commanded that his people bear distinctive markings that set them apart from the rest of the world. Those markings were things like circumcision, kosher dietary restrictions, and the observance of a Sabbath day. And so the question was, if a person was a pagan and came to faith in Jesus, were they welcomed on account of that faith, or did they need to become culturally Jewish before they could become a part of God's people? And this question causes a dust-up between Paul and Peter, two of the most prominent leaders in the early church. Paul recounts the argument that he had publicly with Peter in Galatians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. He says, "When I saw that they," and that's Peter and Barnabas and some of the people who were Jews, "were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas," that's Peter's name in Aramaic, "in front of them all, 'You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew.'" Peter had been dining with the Gentiles before more strict Jews had shown up on the scene. "How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no one can be justified." So the Jewish law had not proven adequate to save people from their sins. And so Jesus' sacrifice had come. And so Paul says, why do we need to have people take the Jewish law? Isn't that cheapening what Jesus has done? To say that we need the Torah and the blood of Jesus in order to become members of God's people. You see, the early church, or at least some of them, took the water of Jewish religious exclusivism over the grace, over the wine of God's grace. You see, making space for the religious outsider when you're an insider is an uncomfortable act that involves humbling ourselves. We struggle with this same thing too, not with the Jewish-Gentile divide, but we have a tendency to create our own boundaries around the people that we consider to be insiders and outsiders. A concept that I find very helpful for us to explore this phenomenon has to do with sets. A set is just when you say of a larger group of things, some things are considered inside and other things are considered outside. And so, for example, we could have a type of set called a bounded set, and that's where you draw a boundary and say what is inside the set is what is inside the boundary, and what is outside the set is outside the boundary. So in math, for example, you could say numbers between 1 and 10, 4 and 2 are inside the set, but 14 is outside the set. In geography, you could say that Kirkland Lake and Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal are in a set of Canadian municipalities, but Tehran and Tokyo are not a part of that set. So we have a tendency, just like the Jews, to create a bounded set mentality about who is an insider and who is an outsider. And we tend to take our own theological and spiritual and cultural and political values and make those the determiner of who is an insider and who's an outsider. Insiders are the people who think this way about a certain theological hot-button issue. Insiders are those who worship in the style that we worship in, and they dress like we dress at church. Insiders are those who read the Bible exactly the same way that we do. Insiders are the people who think about political issues that we care deeply about in the same way that we do. Or think about certain hot-button cultural issues in the same way that we do. And so we spend a lot of effort defining the boundaries between who is an insider and who's an outsider. But Jesus has blown up the boundaries. Many of the people who would consider themselves an insider in Jesus' day, the religious Jewish establishment, for example, found themselves on the outs with God. And at the same time, many people who are far away, the Zacchaeuses, the demoniacs, the lepers who were considered to be unable to join the assembly, found themselves brought in. And so a bounded set definition of God's people is not helpful for us. Rather, a centered set is a more helpful way of understanding things. A centered set focuses on a center, something to which everything else is related. And it's that relationship that determines whether something is included or not included in the set. So if I am standing in the middle of a room, I could say, well, there's a set of people that are walking toward me and people who are walking away from me. Every person whose movement is actually making them further from me would be an outsider, and every person whose movement is bringing them closer to me would be an insider. And I think that this is more about how Jesus envisions God's people. There are people that we presume to be close to God, but that who have turned their back on Jesus, who have rejected his teaching, they're walking away. They're not insiders, despite the fact that they assume that they are. But there are people who are far away, pagans, who are suddenly interested in this new hope proclaimed by Peter and Paul and the other apostles. They're far away from God, but they're coming toward him. And so they receive his welcome. And so when we look at who is our brother or our sister in Christ, we shouldn't look at the person who looks like us and assume that that is the person that is the Christian, the person who worships like us, the person who votes like us. Rather, we should look at people and what do they think of Jesus? What are they doing with Jesus? Are they becoming more like Jesus, or are they becoming less like Jesus? And maybe that's a better determiner of who we consider a brother or sister. But ultimately, we have to also have a certain humility to know that we don't see people's hearts the way that God does. And so it's not our job to say who is an insider and who is an outsider. A second thing that we have to do is to consider our religious rituals differently. Washing and purity can be good things. And they are good things unless they become a substitute for or an impediment to the church's mission. The Jews were called to be a people that were a light to the nations. But the problem is that the Jews before the exile, while they lived among the nations, were completely indistinguishable from the nations. They were both in the world and of the world. When the Jews who returned erected massive barriers between themselves and everybody else, they were faithful, at least externally, to the laws that God had put on them, but at the same time, they were not present with people. What good is it, as Jesus says, to light a lamp and yet hide it under a bushel? So they were neither in the world nor of the world. But instead, we need to follow the example of Jesus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, John says in the prologue to his gospel. Jesus takes on humanity. He becomes as human as we are, and yet he lives distinctly from the rest of humanity. He lives by a different animating principle, by the power of God's Spirit. He lives with a different set of values, one that honors God, dependence on God, love for others, even your enemies, when the world marches to a different drum. And so it is that we who follow after Jesus are also called to be in the world, present among people, integrated with them, interacting with them on a daily basis, and yet to live the new life. The life of the new age dawning in Jesus. An age symbolized by the wine of celebration that he brought out at that wedding. And so, when the world looks at us, do they see the exclusivity of the water? Or do they see the celebration, the hospitality, and the suffering love of wine? I hope that when they see us, they would not see a group of people standing and saying, "Stay away, God is our God, and not your God." I hope instead they would see the wine of celebration. That God has invited everyone to a wedding where he himself will be the groom, and we, religious insiders and outsiders alike, all those who call on his name, are invited as guests. Let us enjoy and celebrate the reconciliation of God and this world. Let us be people of wine and not of water.